he described this sort of view of the temple and the Pinole as this privileged viewscape for the Madisons and their guests that are in the dining room, in the study, on the balcony, on the north side of the house, standing on the portico, sort of meandering out in that area of the lawn. That is a privileged space. It is a view that is cultivated, it is created, it is shaped intentionally to draw the eye to this classical structure, to point towards Madison's control over nature, and sort of allude to the power that, you know, the planter elite can put on the landscape and people and how you experience it. They're all sharing books and stuff. I don't want to get too much into the picturesque design, but all in all, this sort of north yard area, the temple itself is meant to be seen very visibly, but at the same time hiding stuff, and specifically the landscape of labor associated with that building. We don't have a lot of documentation. Oh, by the way, I should mention, feel free to stop me at any time, and if I don't notice, you feel free to just unmute yourself and talk, because I don't think I'll notice if someone types something in, because I get kind of focused. So we do have some pictures like this, this painting or watercolor or whatever it is, depicting an enslaved woman and child sort of walking on this north side of the property, of the formal yard in the vicinity of the temple, probably engaging in labor associated with it. And we do have some quotes that kind of reference the ice house, one from the enslaved perspective, and I'll pull that up later on. But again, it's very minimal. It's top down. It doesn't really get at experiences of that space from their perspective too much. And it can be really hard to use these without a lot of additional contextualization to sort of understand. I'm sorry, I keep using my PowerPoint, not this slideshow. This is the painting I was referencing. In formal yards in general, there is this sort of assumption that is not necessarily accurate, that it was despite it being a privileged viewscape being cultivated specifically for the elite to enjoy, enslaved individuals are present in those spaces. They created those spaces, they maintain those spaces. There's a lot of anxiety at the time amongst the planter elite. There's quotes from Jefferson kind of like talking about weeds, and and Madison too, talking about the landscape kind of going into ruin, or not ruin, but it takes a lot of time and maintenance and a lot of people, a lot of human hours to maintain that picturesque landscape while also maintaining it as an economic output entity. So there's a lot going on, and the formal landscape is part of that. And I think it's easy to lose sight of the presence of enslaved laborers in that space. This painting is a sort of very romantic look at the front yard of Mount Vernon. I picked it because it has a gazebo out front. And you can see it sort of in the background that in the gazebo, there's individuals hanging out there. It's being used at what's called a summer house at the time. There's references from the Montpelier record that mentions the temple being used as a sort of summer house or gazebo type structure as well. But that there are this kind of scene of an enslaved man kind of getting cattle, herding cattle away from the formal yard or something. But and you can see off to the right, there's more individuals laboring in the kind of far distant background going down the hill. So again, I mean, we have to take paintings for what they are. They're biased, just like documents are, and what they want us to see and how they want us to see it, just like the landscape itself, the physical landscape when you're in it. So that's important to note here, in how individuals are being portrayed. Some more examples from Mount Vernon of formal yard spaces and enslaved individuals. the important thing here is just acknowledging their presence, and figuring out how we can go beyond this sort of very surface image. There's this kind of trope of the educated, enlightened elites setting themselves up as these holding a lot of knowledge of as farmers and architects and these things, and they are educated individuals, but it sort of hides the knowledge, the intimate knowledge of the landscape and these formal spaces and how much time they're spending in them for the enslaved community. So I want to sort of like use the temple in this, my thesis, I try to use the temple as an opportunity for going in deeper beyond the surface level as just sort of a case study. Let's see. So I took a couple different theories. If any of you want to read my thesis or did read my thesis, or even a section of it, I have a very long, kind of dense chapter talking about theory, but I'll kind of summarize it. There's two perspectives that I utilize. One is the sort of landscape spheres or spatial spheres, borrowing from an archaeologist, Whitney Battle Baptiste, and then a sort of variant on that theory that Terry expanded in his dissertation from 2014. He was looking at a plantation in Southern Maryland. But the idea is, a lot of you probably are familiar because Matt talks about it a lot, is there's a ton of sites all over the property. And it's really easy to look at these sites as microcosms, just like I kind of intended to do originally with the temple. But they're all connected. The individuals working and living in these spaces are moving about the property. So you have these spheres, spatial spheres. So you can have the home farm as a sphere, the formal yard as a sphere. You can have landscapes of labor, so very specific labor tasks that bring people from one place to another. You have thematic spheres, like privileged viewscapes as a sphere, or performative landscapes, things like that. And those are sort of ways to shift our perspective in how we're kind of looking at a landscape. And this was important because the temple itself is a transient site of labor for the enslaved community. The ice house below it is something that's being used by different people at different times of the year, and we'll go into more detail into that later. But it's not something where you have individuals living and working there constantly all year. So I had to adopt this sort of framework that looks at the whole plantation and sets it as this sort of center point, at least in my research, at which it is intersecting on multiple sort of thematic and spatial spheres, if that makes sense. And if that doesn't make sense, feel free to stop me. The other idea is sort of social network theories, that you can have people, objects, stories, events, ideas, all connected to one another. And in this case, the temple and ice house is again at my sort of center. But the temple is connected to individual experience and ideas that Madison has, that the architects have, the enslaved individuals. It's connected loosely and tangentially to other grand ideas, symbols and art from the time that all of these individuals are being exposed to. So trying to connect all those dots, or bridge those sort of concepts or vectors, takes a little bit of work. But I thought that in order that they went well together, the sort of spatial spheres and the network theory. So does anyone have any questions before I kind of get more into the specific landscape itself? Nope. Okay. All right. So let's see where the infrastructure or the landscape, the physical landscape, was my biggest data set for looking at the temple and the ice house. And that requires looking at the space over time, because the landscape changes a lot, as you all know, especially those who've come on our expeditions or watched any of Matt's other lectures. There's this huge shift that happens from the 18th century into the 19th century, where there's a transformation from the Georgian to the picturesque. And that, you know, it's really easy to sort of lay that out as a timeline, but in reality that involves, again, thousands and thousands of hours of human labor. It requires lots of dirt being moved to create this transformed formal landscape. So all of that work that we've been doing, trying to find all these features and reconstruct the landscape as it was, a big part of that is understanding what it took to create this space. So looking at the north yard, which is, let me see if I can turn this laser pointer on. So that's kind of this area that encompasses the Pine Alley, what's often called Dolly's Midden. Can you all see that laser pointer? Just give a thumbs up if you actually can. Okay, cool. The gully and ravine, the paths and stuff. So I kind of restricted my sort of microcosmos site to the north yard. And some big things happen here. There's some big transitions. In the 18th century, there was a giant ironworks, blacksmith shop. There was a kitchen on the north side of the structure. There are possibly other things going on. Our excavation has been pretty limited to the areas where we suspected there are features. So the Pine Alley. So this whole area, there could be more stuff. There's a lot of utility work and a lot of disturbances that have happened in the late 19th century and 20th century that have kind of made some of the site disturbed, which can make it hard, but that doesn't, you know, we had that at other areas on property and we're able to find out a lot. But it's important to note that in the 18th century, this is an active space of labor where people are living and working, and we have archaeological evidence for that. But in the creation of the Pine Alley, the sprawling green lawn, this temple, this privileged viewscape, this performative landscape, that involves removing the enslaved individuals who are living and working here and putting them somewhere else. So at the same time, you have the construction of the South Yard. You have individuals like Moses, who is the enslaved blacksmith, who was probably working in the space, was moved over closer to the overseer's house where we're digging now in the home farm. So there are transitions going on at this time that are going to affect the daily lives, the routines, the habits of individuals. And these sort of big landscape changes can put into context other events that we know are going on. And it's, in this case, it's going to be causing disruptions. Let's see. Okay. Sorry, I needed to jump ahead a little bit. The biggest part I mentioned is the moving of soil. You all have the creation of a whole infrastructure. It's not just the creation of a formal landscape, the flattening of lawns, planting trees. You also have the digging of the ice pond, channeling you can't see it on screen, but over here there's a Poplar Run was sort of ditched and trenched. There was probably some digging going on to make, this was naturally a low spot, so water may have accumulated here, but to get it to stay would have required some physical excavation of the pond. There were two ornamental islands in the pond during the Madison period that were created, so that was probably excess soil from that process. There was it's hard to see here and in present because the pond has changed shape so much since the 20th century. But there was this apsidal pool, or sort of shallow projection, which may have served as sort of like a docking point for enslaved individuals to where they were harvesting ice from. So, you know, this island, or this pond and the islands, that all had to be created. There would have been roads introduced, and we'll talk about that more later. In addition to that was the physical excavation of a 24-foot deep pit in the ground. Well, it was actually probably 16 because grade was raised, but that's still, you know, no small feat. How many of you dug in the Pine Alley with us, or at least saw what we were digging? Definitely Hannah, I know. Let's see if I can see more people. I don't know if that's possible here. So Stratigraphically speaking, I picked up, there's old pictures. You can see there's, our red clay subsoil is what we usually reach when we get, down a foot, sometimes 2 feet. It's dense, it's hard. There's sometimes lots of rocks in it, but as you keep digging, you start getting this sloppy sort of uh, blue, yellow, what we'll call saprolitic clay. It's basically oxidized metals or oxidized minerals that have pretty heavily decayed, and it's thick, heavy, wet, and hard to get through. So that was all dug through by enslaved individuals to create this ice pit. Brick was laid up against the walls. Although there were probably hired like carpenters, architects, and masons and stuff like that involved with the process, it would have been a smaller team, and enslaved individuals would have been involved definitely in the brick making, in the digging of this hole. So again, some of this is like inferenced from comparative examples from other sites and what we know about how labor is carried out elsewhere. What we don't want to do is assume that there are like 4 guys and an architect hired and they do all this while the enslaved individuals are sort of dealing with other duties on the plantation, other economic roles. The speed at which this was built and other landscape changes happened in a short time frame would have required a lot of people. This was completed in like a year or less. Anyways, so all right. The big thing here, at least in what I'm trying to show in this picture, is the sort of top-down view of these soil types. There's another picture of the blue and red fills in one of the tree holes after we excavated it. On the left on the screen, you see is where the blue clay is, and on the right is the overlying red clay. So you can see the red clay is number 3 in this photo, blue is 2. 1 is related to the 18th century landscape. What I wanted to do is change the way I was looking at the soil and sort of think about it in a different way. We can say, oh, neat, they use the displaced soils to level out the yard to create a flat surface around the temple. That required a lot of work, labor, got it. But one thing that is interesting to observe is that if the laborers digging this pit were to simply just, as they dug, displace the soils outwards from the hole, you would have the sort of higher red clay subsoil displaced first, and then on top of that, you'd have the blue clay fills. But we actually found the inverse, which is an indication that there is sort of staging of soils. You'll notice here, hopefully my laser pointer's still there, yep. Sort of downslope from the temple, there was a disconnected area of blue clay fill that was found. And also the blue clay showed no evidence of mixture with the red clays. They were solid fills. We think, or what I'm thinking, is that these sort of layers of soil were separated by their characteristics, staged in piles, much like landscapers and stuff will do today, for the specific purposes or qualities of that soil. The blue clay, it didn't take but a quick Google search to find a lot of people who live in areas where their like topsoil is blue clay. They have trouble with their lawns and growing stuff. You can't create like a grassy lawn on that soil. So if the soil were to have been displaced as it sort of in the inverse of which it was excavated out, they wouldn't have been able to create the landscape that the Madisons had wanted. It also would have been a pain to walk on and such as a space of labor in which there are carts and loading the ice all around the temple base. So what I'm getting at here is there's a shift in perspective in how we're thinking about the soil, that the enslaved individuals are bringing with them an intimate knowledge of the landscape. They're moving so much soil all across the entire plantation, and we can't separate those events from each other, that the sort of farming that's going on other parts of the property, the knowledge of cutting down hills for farming tobacco, ditching, the effects of that. You gain an experience, and you can pass on that information to other individuals through generations. Some archaeologists will refer to that as vernacular knowledge. I saw someone call it vernacular knowledge of the earth or something. There's different ways of thinking about it, that there's sort of a story here that we need to kind of take back and give to everyone, that this knowledge about how qualities of dirt in the landscape is not just held by elites like Madison or Jefferson and stuff as farmers, that there are individuals actually engaged with what they're doing and making decisions based off of what they've learned. So this is just one possible example of that. Another is all around the temple base is just tons of slag and ash and stuff related from the 18th century blacksmith shop or ironworks. And it's distributed all around the temple base. But one thing that's interesting is it's a pretty thin layer. Going back to this photo, or at least around the temple, you can see in the wall, there's this thin black lens. I don't know if you all can see that very well. This also wouldn't have grown grass too well either. And there's some evidence that slag was being used to line roads and things like that during the period. Because of that, the fact that it's not going to grow weeds and grass as well directly on it if it's on the surface or near the surface. The fact that it's thin might also mean that it's maybe there was some cleanup involved, that it was sort of graded out in preparation for all these other fills. So that's just more evidence of the sort of specific tasks that were going on directly around the temple to create the landscape. But there's other ways of thinking about it. We have this transformation from a smoky, sooty environment where there's a lot of labor going on from the ironworks to this bucolic, green, shady space that is not it's not designed for enslaved individuals. It's designed for elites and guests and the Madisons. And again, to repeat, that involves removing people from the landscape. But for the enslaved individuals, grading away or possibly doing some cleanup of the site at which was at one point was part of their daily lives is probably that's going to be forever embedded in their sort of memories of place, and how every time they return to that space, the sort of recollection and the sort of community memory of what this space looked like prior to it being transformed into a picturesque landscape is there. And we need to consider it in part of how, in what we'll talk about later on in the presentation, how people are engaging with the space in the present. So for the laborers harvesting ice, when they're approaching the ice house, when they're returning to do maintenance or drawing off meltwater, things like that, there is this memory of what this space was like in the past, whether they experienced it personally or whether it was, their parents or grandparents. Okay, so I mentioned, going back, Dolly's Midden. So in the night, you've heard about Dolly's Midden, I'm sure. I don't know what we're calling it now, the North Yard Midden. But there's this basically concentrated dump from the 19th century retirement period downhill from the temple, sort of off to the east. And that is a marked shift from the way that trash is being deposited in the 19th century or the 18th century and very, very early 19th century. Here you have a distribution map showing where you have concentrations of two types of trash from the 18th century. So on the right, you have slag, which you all saw that picture of all the black sooty stuff. So it's concentrated sort of around where the temple would later be put. And in the 18th century, you have trash related to that kitchen that I showed on that map earlier. We have this sort of sheet midden. It's not as dense or concentrated as like the midden down in the ravine. But again, this is just more evidence of how the space is being used. There's a definite drop in the artifacts from the 19th century in this area of the Pine just south of Temple and around the Temple base, that shows it's not being used as an active sort of, it reflects how it's being used at the time, that it's not a space of, oh, looks like I got a message maybe. Oh, thanks, Matt. Main house trash deposit or midden. Thanks, Matt.
No problem. This is great, Chris.
Thanks. All right. Darn. Okay. So if you all haven't had the chance, before, Terry also has given several papers on it in the South Yard, sort of tracking how, and other archaeologists have done this too, how trash distribution can tell us a lot about how the enslaved use a space or view a space or try to reclaim spaces. There's a lot of different ways of looking at it, but in his paper, he looks at the South Yard, and specifically how trash is being kept out, like household trash and work trash is being kept out of the immediate domestic spaces of the quarters in the South Yard and more in the workspaces, which happens to be closer to the main house. And it's interesting that we can sort of frame what you're seeing here on these maps, these distribution maps, which are otherwise just some cool science stuff, but it can tell us about how people are, how they might react to a disruption to place. That there were, again, this is an evidence of how they viewed this space, how they used this space, how it was used for their own purposes, and it no longer became for their own purposes. So it might potentially throw in to new light some of that research that Terry did, that, you know, and he kind of hints at that in his paper, that there was a specific resistance by maintaining swept yards, keeping the trash out of their domestic spaces, putting it closer-ish to the main house in the workspaces, which are pretty well in view from the mansion. That really can be seen as a very active resistance, and potentially a result of having other life ways, like how you used a whole yard space for part of the 18th century, being disrupted. And again, I'm not saying that is necessarily the case, but it's just a way of reframing the way that we might sort of think about the patterns that we are seeing. So I'll take a moment. Does anyone have any questions before I go on? I'm going to talk more about ice house labor itself, with harvesting ice, loading ice, and things like that. Cool. I'd probably get out of water. Okay. So one of the big questions before the most recent excavations in 2017 around the temple base and the entrance was what were the routes of access? What was the approach? The reason this is important is we really want, I just spent that whole last section talking about embodying the landscape, really like how people physically interacted with the dirt. But there's also how people moved about it. So understanding where roads and paths are can help you frame, like, what is the physical experience of walking from one place to another? Are you seen? Are you hidden? Is it a precarious walk? Is it, is it a big path? Is it a small path? That can tell you a lot about what type of equipment you're using, and can tell us a lot about the whole task itself. So answering these questions about what was the access to the ice house like is pretty big part of the excavations in 2017 and also my thesis. So we have this, I think it's from 1833, Chapman sketch that shows this gate. We haven't found the gate, but we also haven't necessarily excavated that far up the fence line to identify it. And paintings and perspectives and sketches can be really hard because sometimes the authors will take some liberty and perspective just to fit stuff in or make stuff not seen. You see that a lot with the pine alley, where the trees of the pine pine layer totally removed because they will obscure the view of the house, and people want you to see the house in the paintings. So there's Liz and Kara. They're pretty awesome. But there's the ice house entrance. There were 2 flanking walls that we found, and you can see how deep below grade they are. Over the second half of the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, there was a bunch of subsequent filling episodes that essentially raised the grade over there, which obscured and eventually buried the ice house entrance entirely. Only like the top sill of the entrance is open or sort of visible today, just because of all the fills. In the 19th century, there was the Thorntons put in a cobble road as part of a bunch of road networks that cut right over top, and you can see where the bricks are, where there's a step down in the coursework of the bricks. I don't know if y'all can see that, but the cobble path actually cut right through there. So some of the infrastructure of the temple entrance was removed in creating that. And then there were several iterations of road on top of that road. Let's see. There's also this path. You've all probably seen it. There's this concrete or cement path that comes up straight from the pond to the temple base, and it based off of the grade, it matches up with the Thornton era path, which is at a higher grade than it was during the Madison period, during the retirement period. You can see over here, just through the spokes of this wagon, there's a bunch of stones piled up over the entrance to the temple, showing that it's not, the ice house is not being used at the time, or at least not that entrance was being used. So there's some question here about which, we have this path here that's going straight. We have a modern path that is cutting at an east to west angle. And we have a lot of disturbance going on. There's in order to create that path for the Thorntons, they brought in a whole layer of fill, which is redeposited 18th century fills to create a roadbed. They cut part of the entry infrastructure down. There's a 20th century tennis court over here. But from the 1908 map and also the LiDAR we did in 2018, you can see this road trace on the north side of the map here that cuts up and around the hill. It's a bigger road. It's described as an old road on the 1908 map, and it's definitely more substantial than this footpath, which is concrete lined. There's a bunch of modern utilities as well, also running along this concrete path. So the idea that this narrow path would be used to haul up and ice down up a pretty steep slope doesn't seem to me plausible necessarily. Also, the fact that it matches the grade of, like, the path goes up to and matches the grade of the later road indicates that it's probably, or very well possibly, a later path. And that this is being described as an old road indicates that it is of an older age, obviously, but also that it's you can see it sort of stops here, and it's sort of, that stopping point is probably in relationship to changes that are happening to the landscape in the late 19th century that is obscuring our understanding of it. But all indications point to this being the road that was used by enslaved laborers. But that's sort of hypothesis. So fast forward. Oh, we also have this, I should have put that earlier. You can see the fence continuing quite a way. We haven't excavated far enough, and you can see there's no gate pictured in this drawing. Again, the pine alley is absent, sort of that problem, again, with using sketches and paintings to tell us everything. They just can't. So the archaeology in front of the entrance showed a bunch of linear, small, shallow trenches that are running east to west, roughly. At the same sort of curvature as the later Thornton era road. So it's possible the Thorntons used that paving to just they put it over top of a pre-existing road, raising the grade, making it flatter, because it was probably on a slope, if you can tell from from here. There's a pretty steep drop off from where the pine alley is, where the sort of flat manicured lawn is, dropping down to the entrance. And there doesn't appear to be that much of a flat space either in front of the entrance for doing any labor. If it was probably pretty precarious positioning. So we have that sketch, which kind of shows, and this is just inference on my part, it shows a gate at kind of an angle from the fence. We have all these post holes you can see here that we identified as part of the front fence. We have underneath the Thornton Era path, we have wagon ruts running east to west, and they match roughly with the position of this ice pond road trace, or what is labeled as the old road on the 1908 map. So the stratigraphic positioning of the wagon ruts underneath more recent late 19th century fills, the various kind of inferring from multiple sketches and images from the 19th century, this is our best guess as to, in all likelihood, this is evidence of how the enslaved individuals were approaching the ice house when conducting ice house labor. And there's a key thing that tells us about the labor too, that what type of tools are being used. So we have wagons or carts probably, since we have wheel ruts. Although it's possible wheelbarrows are being used, there's not, from comparative documentation from the time, there's not too much in the way of wheelbarrows. Again, if they were using that small footpath, it would have been hauling in buckets or wheelbarrows straight up and down a steep slope, which again just doesn't seem likely. Again, sort of reframing this and how I was before with the soil, this is a lot like the idea of thinking about how they're using the landscape to their advantage. So it's possible that the Madisons didn't intentionally say, we're going to put the ice house road here and it's going to be like this. That might have just been a sort of natural development of how the enslaved navigated through the landscape over time. It's hard to tell what was planned and what wasn't in that way, because this sort of marks the edge of the formal landscape. So at what point do you have the creation of a space through processes of everyday labor or as being part of planned, it's sort of planned infrastructure. So it's hard to determine, but again, just different ways of thinking about things. In terms of the process of gathering the ice itself, we do not have any documents from Montpelier talking specifically about how it was being done. We have a reference to a number of wagon loads. I think it was, 29 to 45 loads of ice. So that's also being measured, whether that's in a large wagon, like a four-wheel wagon or two-wheel wagon, a cart, that load is not a sort of standard measurement. But from documents from other plantations, I used Pharsalia, Shirley Plantation, Monticello, Mount Vernon, a bunch of other plantations that kind of use a mix of language, carts, wagons, to sort of infer what that might have looked like. So we have just here a description of, dropping all of the tasks that are being done on the plantation, bringing wagons, all the hands that are available to throw at a pond or a river, depending on where your location is. In our case, it would be the pond, to gather ice. There's some examples that mention it happening over a day, just in one evening, sometimes over multiple days. So it's a pretty labor-intensive task that is disruptive to other parts of the plantation economy, or it's a side sort of transient labor task that is going on. I couldn't find all the pictures or drawings really of labor associated with harvesting the ice itself is from the late 19th century and early 20th century. And at that time, it's a little bit different. So do keep that in mind through the next slides, that the picture, a lot of the pictures are from the Northeast, when it's more sort of industrial, large supply cutting of blocks of ice and shipping them. across the world. So it looks a little bit different when then harvesting ice during the 18th century and early 19th century. So just keep that in mind. I've gotten some sort of breakdowns. A lot of times the overseers are keeping track of distance from the pond to the ice house to the slave quarters to sort of optimize the time it takes to harvest the ice. Also the number of tools required. So in this case, carts and people involved in the task. So this is from Mount Vernon. Mentioned this already from Montpelier. This is reference to an earlier ice house, not the Temple ice house. There was at one point 2, maybe 3 ice houses at Montpelier, probably 2 only at one time later in the 19th century. But that sort of, gets at that task. Tools is something I was really hoping to find when looking at the archaeology itself. There, in the later 19th century, there's dedicated pamphlets, catalogs to selling tools related to ice house labor. But this is, again, it looks a little bit different in the 18th century. There's some examples from Mount Vernon, which they claim are from the 18th century. But when I tried to contact them, they weren't actually sure where those were in the collection. But these are evidence of some of the tools being used. You have axes, pole hooks. It's other types of farm equipment that can be used for other purposes on the plantation, and multiple tasks. So any of you who've come on our log cabin expeditions, these ice hook things on the right, those sort of tongs, those look a lot like the tongs being used for carrying logs and things. Axes can be multi-use tools. Saws are multi-use tools. And before there's a dedicated industry with dedicated tools to the task, you're probably using everyday farm tools that could be used all across the plantation. So just like in this quote from Jefferson that mentions, the whole farm kind of coming together to do this task, where all work is being brought, tools are also being brought from other parts of the plantation. So just because we didn't find tools inherent to ice house labor in the vicinity of the temple and the pond doesn't mean there weren't tools. They probably were just being taken away and being used for other stuff. I will share this PowerPoint with people so they can spend more time reading some of the quotes. Just having stuff mentioning what it's actually like to do the ice house labor. There's reference from Shirley Plantation where there's a lot of planks being laid down to keep the ice clean so enslaved laborers are not actually stepping on the ice. There's a lot of concern about the cleanliness of the ice. So there are some references from Montpelier as well, where there's someone who comments on the sort of muddiness of the ice. It's like a product of all the red clay in the pond. So one's cleanliness of ice was something that was being judged upon by other elites. So that the effects of that sort of social interactions at the elite sphere kind of affect what the labor itself looks like too for the enslaved individuals doing this. So let's see, how am I doing? I'm not doing well on time. So once the ice is harvested up into wagons, it's going to be taking like 45, 30 loads, 40 loads, sometimes over multiple sets of that over days. The ice is being carted up the hill to the entrance. Planks are laid down. We found paling scars in the sort of temple entrance. Paling scars are like little miniature post holes. They're the product of shoving stakes into the ground. And those were likely used to sort of support the planks being laid down from the wagons to keep it elevated off the ground. And I see Nick's here. So ice is being dumped. It's broken up, dumped down into the ice pit, and there are enslaved individuals below actually pounding the ice. This looks a lot different than what it does in the late 19th century, where it's being cut and blocked. There's sawdust put in between the blocks to help prevent the melt. That's just because of the end product, the consumer product in the late 19th century are for ice boxes primarily, whereas in the early 19th century and 18th century, it's very different. And there's a lot of prescriptive literature at the time, and letters that sort of describe the need to pack the ice. You're actually reducing the amount of surface area that is subjected to meltwater. So there's a lot of time spent to do that task. And it was not only miserable for the people down there, the enslaved individuals down at the base of the ice pit, having ice being dumped down while they're packing it constantly. When it's freezing, it's cold, it's dark, it's 24 feet below ground. It's also potentially dangerous. We know that there's a reference from Washington. Let's see, where, I don't know if that's on this slide. Oh yeah, the second quote. Washington was concerned that the upper infrastructure of his ice house would collapse with any like weight on it at all onto the enslaved workers below, possibly killing the individuals, which was a concern for Washington, not only because that would be a disruption to the infrastructure of the ice house and a whole storage of ice, but also to humans as property in this circumstance. So there's multiple levels of economic loss for Washington. So the multiple instances of him writing to his overseer to check on the joists of the upper parts of his ice house reflects that concern. And again, probably an aspect of the everyday sort of or periodic labor associated with the enslaved community and the temple and the ice house is inspecting the structure yearly to make sure that it can withstand and continue to be used over time for this process. And also by not doing that, there is a opposed risk to this already kind of miserable task. Let's see here. There's a sketch. It's from Cuba. It's not very realistic, I don't think. It's showing enslaved individuals in Cuba sort of carrying giant sheets or cubes of ice by hand. That doesn't match well with the sort of documents we have from Virginia, but you know, things are different in different areas for sure. But I wanted to put this behind some quotes from Madison talking about the necessity of ice. It's not just Madison, Jefferson, Washington, they're all writing about how ice is sort of this thing that they are all accustomed to, that they need for the to have meat stored year round, to be able to continually serve guests ice at Montpelier. A lot of people reference being served iced drinks pretty frequently. Ice cream, chilled wines, things like that. It's a big part of the labor itself. And I just think there's, if you read these quotes at face value, if you look at the stuff about Jefferson and his experimentation with ice creams and using snow versus ice or hail, you kind of lose sight of the effects on the people involved in the labor. And I going deeper is part of exposing full narratives. Let's see. I'm not doing. Hey, Matt. Are you there, Matt or Terry? I'm not doing too well on time. Do you think I should break this up and do a separate talk?
We could do that. We could talk, Chris. I'm going to make the next 4 weeks schedule, and
Okay.
that would allow everybody to hear it and digest and ask questions. So if you have a natural break point, that'd be great.
Yeah, I do. I have like one more slide or two more slides that I can wrap up pretty quick, because there's the whole symbolism of the temple and how that kind of, anyways, that I think that'd be better another topic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt.
Absolutely.
So the temple, we mentioned how it's being used as a folly or a sort of garden summer house. It's a place of leisure for elites. There's accounts talking about walking out to it or strolling out to it through the Pine Alley. Again, we also have some quotes that we can sort of get at where the enslaved fit into that perspective. and again, it's nothing really direct. The most direct example we have, at least documentarily, is what you see at the top of this page. It's from an oral history, someone recounting their experience at Montpelier, someone who was enslaved in the early 20th century, talking about using there's an antechamber, this upper storage space in the ice house that's used for storing foods. So she mentions mutton, beef, chickens, turkey, ducks, and there's vegetables and stuff like that. We also have someone from a neighboring plantation who was sending an enslaved worker to bring cream over to their ice house to be stored in the antechamber of the ice house. So that's also an opportunity for interplantation connections, interplantation conversation. And the labor here as a sphere, as I was talking about before, is not just restricted then to the Montpelier as a plantation. It's also connected to other neighboring plantations, the families of the Madisons, as well as families of Montpelier's enslaved community. Let's see here. So I kind of have this hypothetical on this slide. Again, kind of going back to that theme I addressed before, that there's a lot of talk in Ice House, sort of historical, secondary historical sources about how ice was this space or this tool of experimentation for the elite to sort of play with nature, to experiment with different types of ice sources and water sources and processes of packing ice. And it puts all of that knowledge onto white elites who are educated formally in sort of universities and institutions, and sort of that getting their knowledge from books and stuff. So it kind of erases a whole history of which I didn't go super deep into, but ice harvesting is not something new to Virginia. It's not something new to the Middle Ages. It was going on in the Roman times. It went on in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, India, parts of Northern Africa. It's in different ways. And to say that there's this story, which I'll talk about later at a different time, that there's this narrative or this sort of legend that the enslaved community at Montpelier was flabbergasted by the idea of storing ice, and that Madison set up this bet with an enslaved individual that he was right, that the ice would keep in an ice house, and that the enslaved individual was wrong, that it wouldn't. There are some narratives, some oral histories, not from Montpelier, from other places, that mention storing ice in subfloor pits that could be used for medicinal purposes, for bringing down fevers in the summertime, or even possibly making ice cream, or just as an additional storage. I have this picture of a subfloor pit here, and we find a bunch of them at Montpelier. There's no way to know if ice is being stored in them or not. They're most commonly used for root vegetables and personal items and stuff, but it doesn't mean that, there are not elaborate types of ice storage methods that don't involve 24-foot deep ice wells with a folly on top. And to say that that is what it looks like and that's the only way it can manifest, and that the knowledge is centered on that, it doesn't, there's a lot of unknowns of like what, we have other sources of information that can tell us that the members of the enslaved community might have been using ice harvesting at a smaller scale for their own purposes outside of that intended by the Madisons. And I think that touches on every part of the temple landscape, the ice house labor, the way it's shaped, and all of that. So I think that's probably a good natural break. And if you get a chance, read Hillary's article on ice cream. We do know that the Madisons were buying tools for making ice cream while in the White House and at Montpelier. We haven't found any of them that I know of. I don't think, Mary, correct me if I'm wrong. But again, this connects the ice house to the kitchen in the south yard. It's just more connections all across the property of multiple spheres of labor happening. So I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Chris. That was great. You'll have to work out what the title for this part 2, Chris, will be.
Okay. Sounds good. Does anyone have any questions, burning questions? You can email me too.
Chris, this is Dean. Yeah, I was just going to thank you for this presentation. It's very interesting. And I'll be looking forward to the discussion on the symbolism of the temple.
Yeah, it's a whole, it throws all of this
that'll be great
labor
here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward. Thanks. Thank you. It looks like I got a message from someone. Prinny asked, thanks, Chris. Got to jump off. Thanks for joining. Glad you could.
Good seeing you, Prinny. Oh.
All right. Well, if anyone wants, I know Peggy read my thesis. My friend Nick in Alaska did too. He's on here. At least parts of it, anyways. I can send it to you. I can email you or whatever. Or if you have more questions, go ahead and shoot me an email. I'd be happy to answer. Or if there's something I got really wrong or you need to fact correct, that's fine too.
Chris, I'll get everybody's email here. I'm doing a print screen now of everyone that's here, and then we could email everybody the information. Oh, this was
cool.
Great, Chris. This was.
Thanks. I really appreciate you all listening to that. That's a lot of information, and I can ramble pretty good. So I appreciate you all a lot.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks, Chris. I'm going to hop off here. So good job. And I recorded this as well. We can put this up on YouTube. I missed the first 5 minutes. There's a tree guy here looking at a dead pine tree. So
that's okay.
All
Thanks,
right.
Matt.
Bye, everybody.
See y'all. Bye.